There's a strange kind of silence that falls over a person the moment they realize they lost something they didn't know how to keep. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. It happens quietly, usually late at night, when their phone doesn't light up the way it used to, when the group chat moves on without them, when they scroll back through old messages and realize the version of you that used to reply first, laugh loudest, and show up every single time is gone. And they don't know why. They just know something changed, and they can't get it back. That moment is coming for the people who overlooked you. Not because you're plotting revenge. Not because you're playing games. But because you're finally about to become the kind of person the Stoics spent centuries trying to describe. Someone who no longer performs for approval, no longer begs to be seen, and no longer shrinks themselves down to fit into spaces that were never built to hold them. And here's the part almost nobody tells you. The moment you stop chasing, you become impossible to ignore. The moment you stop needing them, they start needing you. It's not a coincidence. It's not karma in some mystical sense. It's psychology, it's human nature, and it's been written about since the days of Marcus Aurelius. Sitting alone with his journal, reminding himself, night after night, that his worth was never up for a vote. If you stay until the end of this, I'm going to walk you through 9 attitudes. Real, practical, almost uncomfortable shifts in how you carry yourself. That don't just help you heal from being undervalued. They flip the entire dynamic. They are the reason people who once walked past you start turning around. Not because you changed to please them, but because you stopped changing for anyone at all. Let's begin. Attitude 1. The silence that speaks louder than any explanation. Here is the first truth almost nobody wants to hear. Explaining yourself to people who already made up their mind about your worth is like pouring water into a cup that's been turned upside down. It doesn't matter how sincere the water is. It doesn't matter how much of it you pour. None of it lands. The Stoics understood this 2,000 years before modern psychology gave it a name. Epictetus, a man who was born into slavery and somehow became one of history's great teachers of inner freedom, said that we suffer not from the events themselves, but from the meaning we assign to them. When someone undervalues you, your instinct screams to defend yourself, to send the paragraph explaining your side, to make them understand what they missed. But that instinct is the trap, because the moment you explain yourself excessively, you hand them proof that their opinion still holds power over your peace. And people can sense that. They feel the neediness underneath the words, even if they can't name it. But silence does something explanation never can. Silence removes the performance. When you stop explaining, stop justifying, stop trying to be understood by people who weren't willing to look closely enough in the first place, something shifts in the dynamic. You're no longer available for the debate. You're no longer offering your dignity up for cross-examination. And ironically, that's exactly when people start replaying the situation in their heads, filling in the silence with their own doubts, their own second guessing, their own discomfort. Silence forces people to sit with themselves, and very few people are equipped to do that comfortably, especially when guilt is involved. Think about the last time someone truly ignored you, not out of cruelty, but simply because they had already moved past caring, already reduced your presence to background noise in their life. Now think about what would have happened if, instead of pleading for their attention, you had simply gone quiet. Not cold, not petty, just quiet, focused on your own life, present in your own days. The kind of quiet that isn't performing hurt, but is genuinely no longer distracted by it. That kind of silence is unsettling to people who are used to being chased. because it removes their power in the exact moment they expect to still hold it. This is not about manipulation. This is not about playing games to win someone back. The Stoics weren't interested in winning people over. They were interested in becoming so internally solid that external opinions stopped having the same grip on your emotions. Marcus Aurelius wrote his private reflections not to convince anyone of anything, but to remind himself, again and again, that the only opinion of his character that truly mattered was his own. When you adopt that same posture, when your silence comes not from bitterness, but from genuine detachment, you stop needing their validation. And the less you need it, the more magnetic your presence becomes, because people are always drawn toward what they can no longer control. There's something else silence does that most people miss entirely. It buys you time to actually observe. When you're busy explaining yourself, defending your character, trying to be understood, you're not watching. You're not noticing the patterns. You're not seeing clearly who actually shows up for you and who only shows up when it's convenient for them. Silence isn't just protection. It's information gathering. It lets you see the relationship for what it actually is, stripped of the noise of your own justifications. And this is where the shift begins. Because the moment you stop explaining and start simply living, focused, quiet, undistracted by the need to be understood by people who already decided not to understand you, you start to change in ways that have nothing to do with them and everything to do with you. That change is the beginning of everything that follows in this list. It's the foundation the next 8 attitudes are built on. And once you see how much power exists in simply choosing silence over explanation, you'll never go back to begging to be understood again. There's a moment that happens to almost everyone who's ever been overlooked, and it usually arrives right after the silence sets in. It's the moment you realize you have a choice to make. You can either sit in the ache of being undervalued, replaying every slight, every missed message, every time you were the one who tried harder, or you can do something the Stoics considered one of the highest forms of self-mastery. You can simply stop caring what they think, not out of spite, but out of genuine indifference to something that was never yours to control in the first place. This is where most people get stuck. Because indifference sounds cold, sounds like giving up, sounds like pretending you don't feel anything. But that's not what the Stoics meant at all. And understanding the difference is exactly what separates people who stay stuck in resentment from people who quietly, almost invisibly, become the version of themselves that others can't stop noticing. Attitude 2. Detachment from outcomes you never controlled. Epictetus built almost his entire philosophy around one dividing line. The line between what is up to us and what is not up to us. Your effort, your character, your integrity, your response to any given moment, these are up to you. But how someone perceives you, whether they value you, whether they choose to notice your worth before it's too late, none of that was ever within your control, no matter how much energy you poured into hoping it would change. Most people spend years exhausting themselves, trying to control the uncontrollable. They replay conversations wondering what they could have said differently. They wonder if they were too much, or not enough, or misread as something they never intended to be. But the Stoic response to this endless spiral is almost jarringly simple: let it go. Not because it doesn't in Virginia, but because your peace cannot be hostage to something that was never in your hands to begin with. Here's what nobody tells you about this kind of detachment. It doesn't feel like relief right away. At first it feels like loss, like admitting defeat, like accepting that maybe you'll never get the acknowledgement you deserved. But something strange happens once you sit with that discomfort long enough instead of running from it. The grip loosens. The obsessive replaying quiets down. And in that quiet, you start reclaiming energy you didn't even realize you'd been spending. Energy that had been leaking out of you. Every time you checked to see if they noticed. Every time you hoped today would be the day they finally understood what they were losing. When that leak closes, something in your presence shifts. You stop performing worth and start simply embodying it, because you're no longer waiting for someone else's approval to confirm it. This shift is what makes detachment so unexpectedly magnetic. People are drawn to certainty, and there is no certainty more attractive than someone who is no longer waiting on anyone's permission to feel whole. Think about the people in your life who never seem to need reassurance, who never seem rattled by being excluded or overlooked. There's a stillness around them, isn't there? Not arrogance, not coldness, just stillness. That stillness isn't something they were born with. It's something they built, brick by brick, every time they chose not to chase an outcome that was never theirs to force. And the people who once dismissed them are almost always the ones who end up circling back, unsettled by a calm they can't explain and can't seem to disturb anymore. There's a deeper layer to this too, one the Stoics return to again and again, the idea that other people's opinions of you are really just reflections of their own limitations, their own distractions, their own inability to see clearly in that moment. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that people who wrong you or overlook you are usually acting out of their own confusion, their own ignorance, their own blindness, not some accurate verdict on your worth. That doesn't excuse how they treated you. It doesn't mean you owe them access back into your life, but it does mean you can stop carrying their misjudgment as if it were truth. Their failure to see you clearly says everything about the limits of their attention, and nothing about the reality of who you are. This is the part where detachment stops being a coping mechanism and starts becoming a genuine advantage. Because once you're no longer emotionally tethered to whether someone values you, you make decisions from a completely different place. You stop over-explaining. You stop over-giving. You stop shrinking your standards just to stay relevant in someone's life. And ironically, that's exactly the energy that makes people sit up and take notice. The same people who once walked past you without a second thought. Not because you tried to make them notice, but because you finally stopped needing them to. Detachment isn't apathy. It's not walking around numb, pretending nothing affects you. It's the quiet, deliberate decision to stop investing your emotional currency into outcomes you can't control, and instead pouring that same currency into the one thing you can control completely. How you show up for yourself every single day, regardless of who's watching. That's the foundation for everything that comes next. Because once you master this, once you truly stop needing someone else's recognition to feel steady in who you are, you become the kind of person whose absence is felt far louder than their presence ever was. And that absence, quiet, undramatic, unbothered, is the exact thing that starts pulling people back toward you, wondering where the person they underestimated actually went. By now, something has already started shifting, quietly, almost invisibly, but unmistakably. You've stopped explaining yourself to people who never intended to listen. You've stopped gripping so tightly to outcomes you were never meant to control. And in that space, something new has room to grow. But here's where most people stall out, right at the edge of real transformation. Because the next attitude isn't about withdrawing further. It's about redirecting everything you were pouring into them, back into yourself, with a level of intention most people never give themselves permission to have. Attitude 3. The radical return to self-investment. There's a quiet tragedy that plays out in so many relationships, friendships, and situationships. A person spends months, sometimes years, fine-tuning themselves for someone else's approval, adjusting their humor, softening their opinions, rearranging their schedule, shrinking their needs down to something more manageable, all in hopes that this version of themselves will finally be enough to be valued the way they deserve. And the cruel irony is that the more a person contorts themselves for approval, the less magnetic they become, because what made them worth valuing in the first place, their individuality, their edges, their unapologetic presence, gets sanded down in the process. Seneca wrote extensively about this exact trap, warning that we lose ourselves not in dramatic moments, but in the slow accumulation of small compromises made to please people who were never grateful for the sacrifice. The Stoic remedy isn't complicated, but it is deeply uncomfortable for anyone who has spent years outsourcing their sense of worth. It's this: take every ounce of energy you were spending trying to be enough for someone else and redirect it entirely into becoming more fully yourself. Not a better version curated for an audience. Not a more agreeable version designed to avoid conflict. The actual unfiltered, fully formed version of who you are when no one's watching and no one's judging. This means picking up the passions you abandoned because they seemed inconvenient to someone else's schedule. It means speaking with the bluntness you used to sand down to keep the peace. It means investing in your body, your mind, your discipline, your craft, not to prove anything to anyone, but because you finally remembered that you are allowed to be the priority in your own life. Here's what happens when you do this, and it happens almost every time without fail. People notice. Not because you're trying to make them notice, but because there is nothing more disorienting to someone who once dismissed you than watching you become undeniable without their input. The version of you that begged for scraps of attention was easy to overlook because it required nothing from them. You were doing all the emotional labor, absorbing all the effort, asking for almost nothing in return except to be seen. But the version of you that stops needing to be seen, that becomes so absorbed in building a life of genuine substance that their absence barely registers anymore, that version is impossible to ignore. It doesn't beg for their gaze. It simply exists, fully lit, in a room they no longer control. This is where self-investment becomes almost strategically brilliant, even though strategy was never really the point. When you pour your energy into your own growth, your health, your skills, your friendships, your peace of mind, you're not doing it to send a message. You're doing it because you finally understand what the Stoics understood, that your time is the only truly finite resource you have, and every hour spent longing for someone else's approval is an hour stolen from the only life you'll ever get to live. Marcus Aurelius, ruling an empire, buried in more obligation than most of us will ever know, still made time every single day to return to his own reflection, his own discipline, his own inner work. If a man responsible for the fate of Rome could prioritize his own growth amid chaos, the excuse that there's no time to focus on yourself starts to look a lot less convincing. And there's something particularly powerful about watching this shift happen in real time, both for you and for the people who once overlooked you. You start showing up differently in rooms. Not louder, not performing confidence you don't feel, but grounded in a way that's hard to fake and even harder to compete with. Conversations you once needed validation in, you now walk through unaffected. Opportunities you once hesitated to pursue because you were worried about disappointing someone. You now chase without asking permission. Your standards, instead of eroding to keep the peace, start rising. Because you finally trust yourself enough to know what you're worth without needing someone else's scorecard to confirm it. The people who once treated you as optional will notice this long before you expect them to. They'll notice the shift in your energy at gatherings, the shift in how you carry conversations, the shift in how unbothered you seem by things that used to visibly wound you. And that noticing will do something to them that your begging never could. It will plant doubt. Doubt about whether they misjudged you. Doubt about whether they let something valuable slip through their fingers while they were too distracted, too complacent, too sure you'd always be there waiting. That doubt is not something you create intentionally. It's simply the natural consequence of becoming someone who no longer requires their permission to feel complete. This is the turning point in the entire process. Silence removed the performance. Detachment removed the grip. And now, self-investment removes the vacancy. The empty space you used to leave for their approval to fill. Once that space is filled by your own growth instead, there's no room left for their opinion to matter the way it used to. And that, more than any clever tactic or calculated move, is exactly what starts to draw them back, wondering how you built a life so full without them in it. There's a particular kind of moment that arrives near the end of this transformation, one that almost nobody expects when they first start the process of reclaiming themselves. It's the moment someone who once overlooked you reaches out. A message after months of silence, a sudden interest in catching up, a comment that feels just a little too curious about how you've been. And here's what's strange. By the time that moment arrives, it barely moves you the way it once would have. That, more than anything, is proof the work actually worked. Because the goal was never to make them chase you. The goal was to become someone who no longer needed the chase to feel whole. But there are still 3 attitudes left to walk through, and they're the ones that determine whether this transformation holds or quietly unravels the moment old temptations resurface. Attitude 4. Radical acceptance of what already happened. The Stoics had a phrase for this. Amor fati, the love of fate, the practice of accepting what has already occurred as if you had chosen it yourself. Most people who've been undervalued spend enormous energy resisting reality, wishing the past had gone differently, replaying the moment they were overlooked and imagining a version where things turned out fairly. But reality doesn't bend to wishing. What happened? Happened. And the sooner you stop fighting that fact, the sooner you free up the energy you've been spending on an argument you can never win. Acceptance isn't resignation. It's not saying what happened was fine. It's saying this is the ground I'm standing on now, and I will build from here instead of wasting my life contesting terrain that's already settled. Attitude 5. The discipline of not reopening closed doors. Once you've built this new version of yourself, the temptation will come, often disguised as nostalgia, sometimes disguised as generosity, to let the people who overlooked you back in without question, simply because they finally noticed you. The Stoic discipline here is patience paired with scrutiny. You don't owe anyone automatic re-entry into your life just because they showed up once you stopped needing them to. Marcus Aurelius wrote about guarding the mind the way a fortress guards its gates. Not out of paranoia, but because what you let back in shapes what you become. Noticing someone's regret is not the same as trusting their change. Attitude 6. Living well is the only real answer. In the end, the Stoics never framed a good life as revenge, or vindication, or someone else's regret. They framed it simply as living well, with virtue, discipline, and presence, regardless of who's watching. If people come chasing, let it be a footnote to a life you were already building for yourself, not the reason you built it. That distinction is everything. And that's the full picture. 9 attitudes, 3 parts of quiet unlearning, 3 parts of quiet rebuilding, all leading to the same truth the Stoics knew centuries ago: your worth was never something anyone else had the power to assign. It was only ever waiting for you to stop asking permission to claim it. If you've made it this far, you already understand something most people never will. That the moment you stop chasing, you become the one who's chased. Not through manipulation, not through games, but through the quiet, disciplined work of becoming so rooted in yourself that no one's absence or presence can shake you anymore. Let's bring it all together one last time. You learned that silence carries more weight than any explanation ever could. That the people who overlooked you don't need your words. They need your absence to do the talking. You learned that detachment isn't coldness, it's freedom. The freedom of no longer handing your peace over to people who never protected it. You learned that self-investment is the truest form of quiet rebellion. That becoming fully yourself again is the one thing no one saw coming and no one can compete with. You learned to accept what already happened instead of wrestling with a past that refuses to change. You learned to guard the door you finally built instead of throwing it open the second someone knocked out of guilt or curiosity. And you learned, above all, that living well was never about proving anyone wrong. It was about finally becoming right with yourself. This is the part where I remind you of something Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself, alone in a tent, during a war, with no audience and no applause waiting for him. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. He wasn't writing for approval. He wasn't writing to win anyone back. He was writing to remind himself, over and over, that the only opinion of his life that mattered was the one he held of himself. That's the same quiet strength this entire journey has been building in you. So if someone comes back, if the silence you kept turns into a message, if the indifference you practiced turns into their sudden interest, if the life you quietly built turns into something they suddenly want a place in, let it happen without needing it to happen. Let their return be a footnote, not a finish line, because the real victory was never their regret. It was you, standing steady, whole, and finally unbothered by the question of whether they'd ever come back at all. If this resonated with you, you already know what to do. Sit with it, live it, and let your life become the only argument you'll ever need to make again.